people who could not attend. So I wanted to make a quick announcement that Global Washington has been doing these webinars specific to COVID-19, and we shifted really quickly in March to respond to our members' need. And initially, we responded to the nonprofits in our community who really wanted to understand how to keep operations going during this crisis. So we held a number of webinars about fundraising, how to apply for the Paycheck Protection Program, how to do communications throughout this period. So those webinars are up on our website at Global Washington if you'd like to view those. We are now in the phase of Global Washington where we want to shift more to issue-specific webinars. This be critical issue of today as we're starting to understand a little bit more COVID-19, especially in the United States. There's a great concern that as COVID-19 continues to spread in the global south, that food insecurity is going to be catastrophic. And I reached out to some of our Global Washington members, and I'm so honored to have these three with us today. These are three leaders in our community that are really trying to mitigate the impact of COVID-19 specific to insecurity. We're getting reports now that acute hunger could nearly double by the end of 2020 due to COVID-19. So we need to address this quickly. And these organizations are, like I said, leaders in our community, and I'm so honored to have them here today. So if you've joined a little late, please type in your name and affiliation in the chat. And we're going to be doing presentations from our speakers. And then around 11 o'clock, a little after 11, we'll be taking questions from the audience. And the way we're going to do that is asking all of you to type in your questions button on the bottom, and then I will verbally filter and to our presenters, and then they'll verbally answer. So let me introduce our speakers for today. First, we have Faustine Wabwire, who just recently joined the Gates Foundation as a senior program officer in agricultural development and advocacy. And prior to that, she's had an extensive background in policy and research, most recently at Bread for the World as a policy advisor, where she was for the past 9 years. She's also a guest lecturer at George Washington University and had a number of positions in Germany and East Africa and all the world. So Faustine, welcome. Next, we have Pierre Ferrari, who's the CEO of Heifer International. And Pierre has a unique background that is private sector and nonprofit. Most notably, he was at Coca-Cola for a number of years. His care and is on the board of Jerry's and the Small Enterprise Assistance Fund. Been on both those boards for over 20 years. And I did notice he has one Northwest connection as well, that for 2 years he was a practitioner faculty at the Bainbridge Graduate Institute. So welcome, Pierre. Next, we have Fatima Sumar, Vice President of Global Programs at Oxfam America. And prior to joining Oxfam, he held several positions in the US government, including one at the Millennium Challenge Corporation, the State Department, and the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. She's policy priorities for economic development for many different regions in the world. She oversees Oxfam's regional development and humanitarian response. Welcome to all our speakers. We're going to have each speaker speak for about 10 minutes each, and then we'll go into Q&A. We're going to start with Fatima from Oxfam.
Great. Great.
Fatima, you're breaking.
Can you hear me okay?
Oh, we can, yeah.
Okay, a little bit louder.
Hmm.
Yeah, Fatima, the connection's not so good.
Okay, let me just, and can the rest hear me okay? I'm not sure if I'm,
It's a little in and out, it sounds like. Do you have anything else open on your computer? Maybe we can. Why don't? Here we go. Do you have a headset?
yeah, let me grab my headset, 1 second, sorry.
Okay. It sounds like my audio might have been up a little bit for people. It might be a busy day for a bandwidth at Zoom. Yeah. How about we go on to Pierre and see, Pierre, why don't we see if our internet is good? You talk about the work that you're doing with Heifer to start, and we could come back to Fatima. Pierre, are you there?
Hey, I can hear you. You hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm Ferrari. I'm President and CEO of Heifer International, and we have been dealing with this COVID-19 situation in 21 countries, about 100 projects out there right now, including the United States, by the way. And the United States story is an interesting one in that I think we've all heard about, but it's part of a thematic that I think is going to be being replayed across the world, which is that the industrial food system, with all of its optimization and uses of high technology and chemicals and large units, be farms or processing plants, is very vulnerable to a disruption. To a small disruption in the supply chain just brings the whole edifice down. And we have an operation in Arkansas, 1,200 acre ranch where we raise cattle, pork, chickens, etc. And we direct mail commerce operation, and we process everything locally in Arkansas with a non-centralized system. And because all of the units that operate feed into, no pun intended, but feed into the e-commerce are functioning very well. There's been no disruption. We've been able to manage the 5 different processing plants. We have one for chicken, one for pork, etc., in a way that protect the workers, which can continue. So, lesson that from it is that efficiency and optimizing those is costing us food availability, food quality, etc. And we're seeing this replicated now in our other programs and projects, such as the one in Ecuador, where the smaller systems are able to pivot and adapt to changing conditions. We have a project called Future Food in Ecuador, which has been providing, that's been training farmers to produce high quality organic food at scale, not large farms, but lots of farmers organized around a co-op, etc. And they were essentially selling their goods to the normal system, the supermarkets and restaurants. But with transportation being threatened with COVID, or workers simply not showing up for work because they're ill or they just feel at risk, the farmers have been able to pivot quickly, again, because I think they're small enough in size to be able to organize themselves very quickly, and have set up unique and independent direct delivery programs. So it's sort of a look on for fresh foods. And we're seeing that in Malawi, we're seeing that in Kenya around the dairy business. The farmers don't, the milk uptake by the processors has fallen off dramatically. What do they do with their milk? And they've organized themselves for local sales and that kind of thing. So the big lesson for us And we've known this all along. We're all sort of, in a way, followers of E.F. Shoemaker, was beautiful. And I think today, given this sort of coronavirus epidemic, the flexibility, adaptability, and resilience in a way of small food systems is something to be thought about. I'm not suggesting that large food system will ever be replaced entirely. Probably not possible. But perhaps with a change in diets and other adaptation, we can go back to systems that are, in addition to being very flexible, are also diverse. The farmers we work with, or the communities we work with and help, we also organize them along a belief that diversification is not only on food needs, but also for market demands. And they've been able to plant and harvest over the past few months, and actually are successfully dealing with major disruptions in labor and transportation, mostly by marketing their goods through the co-ops, but not depending on the industrial systems that they're. That's the big, and the big fear in terms of potential famine is that countries like India and Nepal, Bangladesh, there are massive movements of people leaving major urban centers where they have no work anymore back to the village. And that's creating tremendous problems for the villagers. But there is food in the villages because there are fields by the villages, and if we can, and we are working with our farmers to organize supply, storage, and food distribution, food sales. So that's our experience of COVID. I'm not as pessimistic, at least in our projects, because we've created conditions, flexibility, adaptability, creativity, and that may be an example for future food systems than the radically optimized, linear thinking systems that we unfortunately live with right now. I'd be glad to elaborate. Yep.
Yeah, Pierre, thank you so much for that opening. It's very good to hear about the community development side of this in terms of what's going on specifically with smallholder farmers. Let's try to go back to Fatima. Fatima, let's test. And I think it's probably an overall bandwidth issue, but let's try this.
Great. Can you hear me?
That's
Does this
great.
work?
Yeah.
Oh, yay. All right. A victory for this Friday. So first, let me just say, Kristen, it's so great to see you. It's so great to be here with you, the Global Washington community, with Pierre and Heifer International. Justine, welcome to Gates. I'm so excited to work again with the Gates Foundation. And just, we're so thrilled at Oxfam America to be part of the Global Washington community. Thanks so much, Kristen, for bringing us into this space. I thought what I would do is build on some of the comments Pierre made and just scene set a little bit, big picture. What are we seeing right now? We're about week 7, week 8 into it, depending on when the clock started, at least here in the US. What are we seeing right now? What can we anticipate? And then really tee it up for Faustine to bring us home with how we're gonna solve all of this and really kick off a discussion. So let me just say, you know, as we think big picture about what is happening right now, we know the death toll is rapidly rising. We've already surpassed 70,000 here in the United States alone. And we also know this is the tip of the iceberg if and when the virus really penetrates into the world's vulnerable communities. So a lot of analysis has been done to date with wide estimates, but at the worst end, we could see up to 500 million extra people pushed into poverty because of COVID-19. Right? If we don't collectively take the steps to mitigate this crisis. Now, first and foremost, this is a public health crisis. But when we step back, and we all know because we work on this stuff every day, it's the intersectionality of this crisis that makes it so unique, right? It's not just about sanitation and public health. It's not just about food security. It's not just about climate. It's not just about gender and the most vulnerable. It's about all of it together. And it's that intersectionality that it makes it such a challenge for us as we think about both current responses, what to plan for in the recovery phase, and how do we really build back better. So let's just step back for a moment and scene set. Pre-COVID-19, we knew that about 820 million people went to bed hungry every night, right? This is before COVID hit. In places like Yemen, Syria, and Sudan, about 135 million people face acute hunger challenges every single day, pre-COVID, whether or not COVID has penetrated, that push them to the edge of starvation. So when we talk about the hunger crisis, the food crisis, the stakes are really high for what we're dealing with. We know that this is not just a hunger crisis that's going to potentially affect refugees and IDPs. This is also something that will penetrate urban centers. You heard Pierre talk a little bit about that just now. And we also know that urban food insecurity is likely to increase as access to food is curtailed and as the economic downturn hits low-income households particularly hard. And of course, this will disproportionately impact women and low-wage workers. So we're seeing some of this already play out. So let's look at Zimbabwe, for example. In Zimbabwe, the combination of successive droughts and economic stress compounded by the shutdowns from Corona have really resulted already in a massive hunger crisis affecting both rural and urban populations. In April, the World Food Program provided assistance already to approximately 1/4 of the population, including in Harare. Due to that response, and depending on when they lift the lockdown, the situation both in Harare and in other urban centers could remain very difficult. Now, compounding this is the fact that COVID-19 is coming on top of a climate crisis that's already threatening millions of lives, particularly for those who either work or depend on the agricultural supply chain. Other natural disasters were already taking place and are intensifying, such as the locust infestation in the Horn of Africa in the Middle East, that's already devastating crops and pushing farmers to the brink. So it's this intersectionality of these threats that makes it incredibly challenging for all of us as we think about responses. So in this current context, Oxfam, which is, as all of you know, a global INGO with a very simple but profound mission, which is to end the injustice of poverty, we're concerned that the disruptions to production, increased food prices, and increased poverty can lead to a spike in both hunger and malnutrition. There's 4 interrelated shocks that I want to just put on the table for this conversation that could really drive an increase in hunger. The first is supply shocks. So shocks to both local and global food supplies could occur as a result of the production shortfalls or measures associated with the restriction of movement of food, especially for those countries that rely on imports to meet food needs. So we're already seeing that droughts, locusts, other climate-induced patterns have already stressed out production. In Ethiopia, the locust invasion is resulting in the loss of approximately 1.8 million metric tons of vegetation per day, right? So supply shocks. The second is price shocks. So we know that export restrictions, supply disruptions, production shortfalls, and hoarding of food, these are all things that can lead to increasing prices for basic staple foods like rice, maize, and wheat. These are food products that people rely on for daily sustenance. Already we're seeing that at least 10 countries have some sort of export restrictions in place. Third, income and livelihood shocks. So as economies are shutting down and as people are quarantined, the economic impact has been severe and dramatic. It's causing a sharp decrease in people's ability to purchase food and other basic necessities like medicine or soap or menstrual products. Informal wage workers and women, again, particularly the most vulnerable and hard hit. And women who work in these sectors are heavily impacted by the economic blows of COVID-19, including in sectors like tourism, restaurants, food production, and of course in the informal sector as well, like vegetable traders or small business owners. So the fourth shock, nutrition shocks. As families are forced to shelter into place, as their access to healthy, fresh foods is curtailed, they can resort to eating packaged foods, processed foods that are higher in fat, sodium, and sugar. So during a health crisis, this lack of healthy food can further compromise people's immune systems and affect children's growth. For women in particular, given that they often eat last and least, they're at the highest risk of malnutrition when food security within households is threatened. So these are some of the big areas that we're watching very closely as we think about response. Oxfam is working today in about 50 countries, actually more than 50 countries, to meet the needs of people who are feeling the biggest hits from COVID-19, both responding to humanitarian need, advocating for markets to remain open, making sure that we're protecting livelihoods, particularly for agriculture producers, and that we're advocating for strong, multifaceted, coordinated response from governments, the private sector, and other actors. Kristen, I just want to end by informing this group that just this Wednesday, so 2 days ago, we released a report at Oxfam, and I urge all of you to go check it out. It's called Whatever It Takes. And the report is quite powerful in sending a message that if we're really going to fight this at the scale that is going to be required, it's going to require a massive increase in the type of aid and how we spend that aid to date. And it's going to be unlike anything we've done before at a scale that's frankly unprecedented. We are calling in this report for, or the UN is calling, I should say, for $500 billion in aid to help low and middle income countries. Oxfam has calculated that for OECD DAC countries, the fair share of this response would amount to nearly $300 billion. So that's the scale that we're talking about here. We all know, because we work in this sector, how hard it is to get our governments to respond at that scale to meet these needs. So that's our collective challenge before us, and excited to be part of this discussion. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Fatima. That was a great global view of the crisis that's happening right now, and some of the interventions that Oxfam is doing and what is needed in the future. I'm going to turn to Faustine now. Would you tell us from your perspective a little bit more about the situation? And I think you have some slides to share. So you want to share your screen and go through those slides?
Sure, thank you. Pardon me. That's what I meant to share. Can you see it now?
Not yet.
Okay. Okay. How about now?
It's coming, yep.
Okay.
Got it.
Thank you. So like Kristen said, I think to add to what the other speakers have said, I'm just very glad to be here. And it's energizing to know that we are all in this together, in spite of the challenge ahead of us. I think the whole idea of solidarity, this is a global challenge and we need that global response. And I think to the extent that we continue to energize each other in our respective spaces where we work, it's gonna help us move forward. So to just build on what Pierre and Fatima have mentioned, and like Kristen said, I joined the foundation 8 weeks ago, right as the crisis was hitting. And I must say that it's like many of us, it's making us rethink what our priorities are right now. Much of the work that we are doing is helping governments prioritize and do not make mistakes in shifting funding from sectors like agriculture that are important. And I think that's the kind of the level of panic that policymakers will move to if we don't have a right approach to advising what matters in the intersectionality that Fatima just mentioned. So I thought I would start by just kind of taking a step back and reminding us all where we were in 2007, 2008, when we experienced this unprecedented global food price crisis. And a couple of factors were responsible for that. For over a decade, we had, just for the most part, both national governments and the global donor community had shifted attention from agriculture to funding other areas. And it didn't take a whole lot to understand why the global food price crisis caught many of us in the global community unprepared. With that, we saw there was also obviously a rising demand in food as a result of a growing population. But then again, the decreased investments in agriculture over previous decades played a big role, which then inevitably led to lower prices, and that disincentivized farmers, frankly, from producing and led to all kinds of productivity losses. There are also other factors related to distortions in agricultural markets where foods were shifted to fuel and all of that. And you should see to the right of that slide is kind of just gives a sense of what happened that year and the years that followed, that prices of staples around the world rose dramatically. And the result of that, as we remember, were, civil unrest across the world in over 40 countries. We saw citizens get to the streets out of frustration. And I think as we look at the evolving crisis right now, it's important to keep that in mind. That this, again, like Fatima said, the intersectionality of food security, of global stability, of market stability, of health system, and all of that are kind of issues that we have to keep in mind as we think of solutions and building back better. But there were a couple of lessons, obviously, that we learned from the 2007-2008 crisis that could inform how we respond to the evolving crisis of COVID-19. One of those that we I think have been glad to have gotten is just that leadership matters at the national level, at the local level, and at the global level. In 2007, 2008, the US government led massive responses to the 2007 crisis that led to not just bilateral recommitment to agriculture, but also multilateral responses. For the US government, for example, we are familiar with the US Global Food Security Program called Feed the Future, which over the years has shifted the way US foreign policy supports agriculture, shifting from predominantly relief to more long-term investments in agriculture, supporting smallholder farmers, supporting governments, make sure that markets function better. On the global side as well, we got leadership around a multilateral program called Global Food Security and Agriculture Program. This was led by both donor governments and the private sector and national governments as well. So we kind of saw a galvanizing of leadership, both political and financial. And that's how we've managed to build some of the gains over the past decade that got us out of that food crisis. Just a little over a decade ago. At the national level and regional level, we saw governments and continental efforts around, in Africa, for example, the Malabo Declaration of 2014, which recommitted African leaders to increasing investments in agriculture. That had begun several years before, but I think the global leadership has continued to incentivize and encourage and leverage leadership from both the public and private sectors to really pay attention to agriculture. Over the last couple of years, at least over the last decade, there have been gains that we've made, but unfortunately, with the onset of COVID, we could see those gains wiped away if we don't intervene in time. And I think one of the other major lessons too during that crisis was that even short bouts of shocks like that can cause significant economic and social damage. And that's a lesson we want to be prepared with as we intervene in COVID. I just thought I would share this, for example. Fatima just said, it's a crisis within a crisis. There's the locusts, there's climate change impacts. Countries like Malawi are still reeling from the effects of Cyclone Idai of 2019. So governments are grappling with limited investments, with policy prioritization, with evidence, the need for evidence to make better and informed choices. Here is an example again that IFPRI just put out, and this is based on a 5 to 7 week lockdown scenario. This is how difficult the situation is going to be, or is focused to be, for a lot of these countries. We see likely dramatic increases in the number of poor people in countries like Nigeria, which largely depends on oil. Well, we know what's happening all right now. Nobody's flying anywhere. We're not consuming oil in our regular transportation sector. Is the largest consumer of crude oil. So for countries like Nigeria with very limited diversification of the economy are feeling shocks that are just unprecedented. Other countries in the global south, whether it's around exports like horticulture, those that are perishable, that can't be stored for long periods of time, are also seeing significant losses. And so that obviously has implications for how much governments have left to bolster agricultural growth, invest in nutrition and all of the sectors that we need to build back better to strengthen our economies. Here's another example of what USAID's early warning system has just projected, that in the next million people require humanitarian food assistance. And you can see that countries, bubbles that are over 15 million people are also countries that are classified as fragile, meaning there's either conflict in parts of the country or all countries, the entire country is in conflict. So again, crisis upon crisis, and how understanding all of these dynamics is important to the kinds of solutions that we want to ask for. Having said all that, I think that the crisis also gives us room to pause and reset. We have learned over the last decade that we have lots of tools in our toolboxes to address emerging crises like this one. But we have to act quickly because the window of opportunity is limited. To prevent famines and widespread mass hunger scenarios, we need a coordinated response. And that needs to filter all the way from the local level, national, regional level, and to the global actors that we engage with, especially, for example, here in Washington. As the crisis evolves, there's a natural tendency to obviously reach people quickly to save lives in the immediate term, and that's fine. But I think we've also learned an important lesson that we need to build resilience. We need to bridge the gap between humanitarian or relief interventions with long-term support so that we build back a little better rather than focus on one over the other. Governments, like I said, are grappling with making choices given the limited resources they have. Should they prioritize health over agriculture? We know that's not the way to go. So we are working directly with governments to provide the evidence base for why it matters to invest in nutrition right now. Pregnant mothers, children under the age of 2, critical to reach populations like those quickly. One other issue we're hearing from government officials, we just had a call with part of agriculture, and leave that having a coordinated approach towards strategic food reserves at regional level is important in boosting the confidence of governments to actually allow food and other essential supplies to flow. Without that, it's difficult to convince any government that the stockpiles around the world is sufficient for everybody. And so supporting governments build strategic food reserves closer to where they're needed, where the food is needed, is important. One other area that I think we are, having a lot of conversation about is just about better governance of global markets. And I think transparency here is so critical. Transparency of the management of the global market information systems, ensuring that governments understand that areas with surplus food can readily allow that food to move to where there is deficit. So we have that free movement of trade, of goods, and essential services important. The last point I'll say, and I think all of our other speakers have said, is that we should also just be thinking about the integrity of our global cooperation. I mean, we are all talking about a global pandemic requiring a global response, but what does that really mean in our world today? We are fragmented, frankly, but then we know that we will not get ahead of this pandemic unless we truly recommit ourselves to a true global approach. And one of that is essentially just doing exactly what we've been pushing for, is a One Health, where we are considering the health of the planet, sustainability in the way we produce our food, sustainability of the human population, that's the health system, as well as the health of animals. And I think COVID-19 provides us that opportunity to really reset the button and do build back better. I'll stop there and look forward to further conversations.
Great. Thank you, Faustine. That was very informative. Thank you so much for the slides and presentations. Can we make these slides available after this to participants?
Happy to.
Great.
Sure.
Thank you. Okay, we would like to take some questions from the participants, the audience listening in now. So if you have a question, please go to the Q&A tab that's on the bottom of your screen and type it in there. And again, I will verbally ask these questions to the panelists and they'll share their answers with everyone. The first question I'd like to go to is for Pierre. This question states that food system experts agree that small food systems are very good, and that sometimes efficiencies in larger systems are actually create a downfall. But in your experience, what are the biggest barriers to achieving these smaller food systems, and what needs to happen?
Yeah, it's a good question, and we're very busy doing but our point of view about the solution to this is actually based on capital. Poverty traps at this local level have to do with irrigation, storage, transportation, processing, etc. And the largest systems, the ones that are promoted by USAID and the World Bank, everything else, sort of monopolize the system and exclude smallholder farmers. So the provision of capital, and I don't mean philanthropy, I mean investment capital, especially if the farmers are organized in co-ops, some kind of arrangement that allow for the funds to flow with some kind of collateral, if you like, but not collateral the way you would understand it, functions very well. And what we found, our experience, is that once we begin to offer capital to well-trained smallholder farmers, local MFIs, local financial institutions follow very quickly, because the challenge they see is investing in small agriculture looks very risky to them. And of course, we don't. We see the opposite. We look at through the telescope in the opposite end. We say that we know, and we have a lot of experience, that if the farmers are well trained, and by the way, mostly women, whether it be in livestock management or even crops, but livestock and this may be a sort of a promotional for heifer, but livestock is very profitable, whether it be chickens or goats or dairy. It happens to be a lot more profitable and can be cash flowed a whole lot easier than crops. Milk, for example, dairy is, of course, produces, if you have access to a market, you don't have to have access to a big market, is a daily cash producer. Chickens with layers, with eggs, could be the same thing. Those are the kind of on the ground, boots on the ground kind of concerns and perspectives that can change this. I would just add one more thing to food strategies. One of the great, I think, dramas in African agriculture is how dominated they are with imported food, when in fact they could grow it themselves. We're looking at the tomato market right now, which is really, what's that got to do with livestock? But anyway, we're doing a tomato market, and the percentage of tomatoes that's actually imported is absolutely almost sinful, when African growers could absolutely grow it themselves. There's no question. But they have to be organized. They have to have the capital and the processing, the transportation. All those things is what can change agriculture in Africa. It is not, in our belief, and maybe we're clearly biased, it is not the large producers and large farms that will solve this problem.
That's great. Very good answer. We have some more questions coming in. I'll direct this one to Fatima. And if Fatima, if you want to add on to anything Pierre just said on the previous question, you can. But this one specifically asked, what kind of responses should climate change organizations focus on to address the food crisis? And are there connections and conversations on landscape approaches? So Fatima, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah. So could I just add on to what Pierre said first, and then I'll come in on climate. So very much support what Pierre was just saying, and just a couple of concrete things we could be thinking about. As you think about the potential break in global food supply chains, so we have a huge opportunity actually in the responses that all our organizations are trying to figure out what to do, is to think about what does Build Back Better mean in this context, right? So first is, to Pierre's point, for decades now, our food systems have prioritized efficiency over resiliency. Mm-hmm. So it may be time to change that equation now and really focus on, these trade-off of the limitations of what we're now seeing. So, when the supply chains are breaking in one country or in one region, consumers all over the world, even here, right, in the United States, are feeling these effects, right? You're seeing the runs on grocery stores for different types of products. So building more local food systems, addressing the challenges that Pierre said, and really focusing on how we reduce the length of the value chains that increases this relationship between producers and consumers. Right now, the gap is so massive in our global foods chain between producers and consumers. So if we think about how do we shorten that gap and make it more localized, that's something we've been talking about forever, actually. But how do we actually do that now? And how do we do that for the very people who, frankly, could be the ones the most affected and the most hungry, including those who, ironically, are farmers, right, in the system, and who are getting more and more into debt, right? Every day as we speak, their debt rises from dealing with all of this. The second is, we do have an opportunity in our influencing with governments in developing countries to thinking about how they use their food reserves wisely and appropriately. So, many governments all around the world, they hold reserves of food, right? They'll hold grain, they'll hold corn, wheat, helping governments monitor their prices, release the food from these reserves if the prices spike. Not being afraid to distribute or request assistance from international and national organizations or businesses to distribute the food to the needy and to make sure it gets there. Oxfam has done a lot of this work in West Africa, for instance, but these are models that can be scaled up and applied in different regions as well. The third thing I just wanted to add here are open food markets. Right? So we know the power of open food markets. The vast majority in Africa, for instance, they continue to buy their food in open markets. So we want to make sure that those markets don't shut down prematurely because of the threat of COVID-19. So making sure they stay open safely, of course, is a collective challenge for us. But we want the shutting down of those markets to really, in some ways, be the last resort governments take and instead use the opportunity to deploy advice for food safety, social distancing, sanitation, wash systems instead in public spaces so that people can still get their food in a safe way. A few countries are already coming up with innovative ways of doing this, but let's share those examples. Let's see where we can scale that up so that we're not seeing governments use last resort items as their first lever when the crisis really starts to scale up in massive ways. On climate, I would just say, I think this is a huge opportunity for us to think about what does Build Back Better mean when it comes to resiliency and building a climate agenda that actually is a sustainable environmental and economic agenda that comes out of this, so that it's not just a return to normal when the pandemic is over. Now, when I say the pandemic is over, I want to caveat that because, you know, we're human, we're psychological beings. Me personally worry that in the United States, when the restrictions are lifted and our kids are back in school, and I can't wait for that day, by the way, but when our kids are back in school and life has returned to what, you know, our new normal, that we're going to forget, right? It's going to disappear from our headlines. We're not going to appreciate and realize the catastrophic impacts that are happening in so many other places. And we're going to miss opportunities to really build back a stronger climate agenda, environmental agenda, and a resiliency agenda at the heart of this. So I would just say big picture, I see huge opportunities to link the intersectionality of this approach right now. And I really just, last thing, I really appreciated, Faustine, your, on one of your slides, this idea of bridging the humanitarian development divide, right? We've been talking about this for a long time. I mean, if there was ever a time to do it, it's now. So that's what I would just quickly put on the table.
That's great. Thank you. A lot in there. I think we are all hoping Build Back Better should be the slogan for whatever we do moving forward. I'm going to turn to Faustine for this one. Eric Klunder asked if you feel like there is any hope in this time of extreme need where we could witness a global approach that brings together Western countries and China and organizations working together to support the global South. Or do you think that the influence of competition will continue to separate people?
What a question. Thanks for that. No, I am hopeful. I'm hopeful, and I think, like Fatima just said, I hope that we can all just take a pause and think about what this means for each and every one of us, regardless of where we live. Because the crisis touches on whether it's a high income country, low income country. And I think, so I'll say two things to this. One, there's a likelihood that we will rally together because, you know, in that solidarity that everybody is impacted, that our food supplies are disrupted right here in the US as they are in Ghana and in another place. The flip side of that could be that countries turn more inward looking, and at a time of intense debate around budget and, you know, domestic demands and needs, that we completely again fall back to, you know, the competition that is actually frankly not leading us to a good place and for the global good. So I think that, but okay, having said that, I really honestly believe that this is something we haven't experienced, at least in our lifetime. And I think that's what I keep counting on, that when we had the 2007, 2008, there were winners and there were losers. In this particular one, I think that we are equally affected. And that's where I post my thoughts, which is why a lot of our engagement with governments, both from the messages we are sending to Congress and those that we are passing with governments in the global South, is that local markets matter, global leadership matter. And we can't do one or the other. We have to do both. And I think there's an awakening from all of us. So to whoever asked that question, I am hopeful, and I sign my life up to this. I'm going to work so hard advocating for that, in case anybody forgets.
So great, so great. I want to get in two more questions, and then I'm going to come back to Fatima and Pierre to ask if you're hopeful as well for the broader issues. But Pierre, this one I want to give to you. Fatima even talked about building up local food markets and supply chains. This question is more specific to how do we build up local inputs such as feed, fertilizer that are usually imported? Do you have a perspective on how to build that up?
Yeah, so the approach we've taken to create local markets and local supply chains that are not disrupted by, shipping costs or oil costs or the other way around is actually to form the infrastructure based on co-ops, farmer co-ops. You need that institutional structure with which to be able to buy efficiently, with which to distribute to farmers. So that's one important step to do. And the co-op, what we have found, our experience is that you begin to get them, for example, in marketing co-op. You begin with that first task. They very quickly learn that setting up a small, for the livestock management, a small feed plant is very easy to do. It's a $10,000, $12,000 investment. The machinery is easily operated. It's easily fixed. A lot of people in these communities know how to fix a car, and this machinery is not complicated to maintain. So they get into that. And then on the health side, the animal veterinary science is actually also fairly easily handled by finding somebody in the community who is looking to build a business around animal health. And we train them. We train them in the skill set. And then the supply chain can be a little tricky. There's no question. You have to go find the pharmaceuticals. But the skill in terms of how to distribute and actually to diagnose the animal, it's a 20-80 rule. 20% of the problems, or 80% of the problems are solved with 20% of the pharmaceuticals. So all these things can be done very locally. I might as well jump in there. The question about global engagement, I think is just totally wrong. I think if you look at the value chain, the supply chains that are global in nature, all of them are oppressive to smallholder farmers. All of them. Or if you know of one that's actually productive for smallholder farmers in terms of creating dignified income and dignified lives, tell me about it, and we'll go copy how they do it. But coffee, cocoa, vanilla, all of these value chains which are global in nature are oppressive, exploitive, and extractive. So we don't want that. Why do we want that? Why do we support that? One, because of course the lobbying power of all these large companies, that is one component. But the other is that, we are sort of prostrated at the gods of efficiency, as opposed to the gods of wellness and well-being and human welfare. I'll stop there.
That's great. No, that's very good to get those points in. I think a lot of people on the call are with you on that. We're running short on time, but we do have a question. If Fatima, you can answer really quickly, because we have talked about the locust infestation, especially in East Africa. Can you talk a little bit about what's going on with that, or what's being done about that?
Yeah, thanks, Kristen. So let me just focus on three specific ways that we could be working towards helping on the locust infestation, which is quite severe and impacting thousands of farmers right now, and really just destroying their crops altogether. And this was, again, pre-COVID and now being exacerbated. So first is real-time monitoring on information, so we know where the swarms are developing, the locations. This is really key to treatment. So active monitoring is really key. The second piece is active treatment of these swarms so that we can limit the destruction that is taking place on farms. It can be done at the farm level. It can be done also at the landscape level, right? With aerial spraying or other types of interventions. So the second is active treatment, and these are doable solutions. And then the third is really helping farmers focus on livelihood recovery. So for the farmers that have lost their crops already, that their season is lost, they'll need seeds to replant, they may need help with debt and other kinds of active support. So those are the three ways that Oxfam, and I know many others, are focused on supporting farmers during this incredibly difficult time, both in the Horn, East and Central Africa, and also the MENA region.
That's Great, thank you. So I want to pose a question to all of you. And again, Faustine mentioned this. I want to ask, are you hopeful? We are in the early stages of the pandemic moving to the global south and impact on food security. So are you hopeful? And all of you have mentioned the impact of good leadership and that we need good leadership at the local level and governments and all throughout all of this. So if you could also add one example of excellent leadership that you've seen during this crisis, whether it be again at the community level or international level. Pierre, I'll start with you. We'll loop around one more time.
So the Heifer network, we've got about 1,000 employees in the countries in which we operate. And perhaps less known is that we operate with private, local project partners. And that gives us a network of about 9,000 people that are essentially in the communities with which we work. And so the leadership has been provided by our country directors to provide the information that's been very readily available in terms of social distancing, masks, etc. So the first thing is information that this is going on, so there's no panic. And that's been quite successful in terms of informing the various farming communities. And the report that I'm getting back is that people are actually doing it. It's one thing to let them know, is the other, are they actually doing it? There's a dearth of masks that the supply is not so much limited as it's just not available. I mean, it's not available, it's very limited. But where we can, we are distributing, or we're stimulating the farmers with whom we work who have some cash, because we've been working with them, of course, and they are equipping themselves as quickly as they can. So it's actually a very simple step, but an important step, and that's what's happening.
That's great. Thank you. Faustine, you already mentioned that you are hopeful, but do you have an example also of good leadership?
I do, and I think I'll just add to what I said earlier. I think why I remain hopeful is that it's going to be a matter of time until we all calculate the losses to all of our economies and just realize how interdependent we are. I mean, global southern countries are not just recipients of things. I mean, you think about export markets, just taking like the US, I think developing countries account for over 90% of US goods overseas. So I think that behooves all of us to look at this as a problem, a challenge that affects all of us, and to the degree that we can agree to support each other in solidarity versus this isolationist trends that we are seeing. But something very specific I would mention that I think gives me hope is that, we are talking about the impacts of lockdowns, and this is a desperate situation, and therefore desperate measures like lockdowns that would unfortunately lead to food crisis. But one of the things that I've seen, and again, we've worked on this for many years, calling for local capacity. And as we speak right now, I mean, the African Union managed to mobilize African countries pretty early enough. We now have an Africa Center for Disease Control, which is helping to coordinate efforts around the response on the continent. During the Ebola crisis, the lab was set up in Senegal, and part of that infrastructure has also been repurposed right now and is helping to produce testing kits. Senegal is producing testing kits locally at $1 per test kit. So I think that's the kind of local leadership and response that gives me hope. And to the degree that we continue to collaborate globally and lead locally, I think we are heading in the right place.
Fantastic, thank you. Fatima, if you could do a brief closer here for all of us.
Yeah, so I'm struggling with your question, to be honest. It's a really hard question because I'm frustrated personally by the lack of leadership here in the United States at the national level, because it's literally killing lives every single day. And it's compounding the effects overseas. And so I think it's a moment for us here in the United States with a real reckoning of what global leadership looks like here in the United States and why it matters so much. And I think that is going to be something we all need to keep pushing and working on. At the same time, I'm incredibly humbled and inspired by how local leaders all around the world have stepped up. And that includes things like our public school teachers and superintendents, our governors, our mayors, community organizations, food banks, just local citizens making masks for each other. In some of the toughest places in the world, like in Jordan, on the outskirts of the largest refugee camp, some of our staff at Oxfam that are the ones that are supposed to be going into the camps to do a lot of this work on the sanitation, they haven't had access because of the lockdowns. And I'm inspired by these stories I hear of them using Zoom and all these digital settings to train people who live in the neighborhood who have just volunteered to step up because they have access and they're gonna take and do what they need to do during these moments. So I am frustrated by some of our national leadership, at the same time incredibly humbled, inspired, and motivated by what we see all around in the United States and every other country around the world right now. And I'll just end with this, you know, pre-COVID, we've been arguing and pushing, many of us here in this community, for a fundamental transformation of the humanitarian system to turn it on its head and push for local leadership to be at the heart of humanitarian response. It makes perfect common sense. And despite that, our entire system is structured from the global north, right? And it is far away with all of us in elite institutions who dictate the terms, the resources, and the power. If there was ever a time to empower local leadership to actually let us lead through this crisis, it's today. And I do take hope and comfort that together, I think if we can collectively push a local agenda, push our power, our money, our voice down to the local level, and let local women and let local organizations lead, we can kick this and we can do this. As Faustine said, we have every tool in the toolbox. The trick now is we're gonna have to reconfigure the wrench a slightly different way, right? In order to rise to the challenge of the day. So I think that's our collective hope, aspiration, and prayer as we do this.
Right.
I'll end there.
Thank you all so much. We're at time for this event, but that was both informative and inspiring. Thank you for lifting up the voices of local leaders, and thank you for your work on all these issues. As I mentioned, Global Washington will make this recording available for others if you want to share the news and send the link to others that couldn't join us today. And next Friday at 10 o'clock a.m. Pacific time, Global Washington will host another webinar specific to refugees and internally displaced people. So please join us for that webinar. If you have other webinar ideas, send us a note at Global Washington. But thank you again to the speakers. Thank you for all your work. Everyone on this call, be well, stay safe. Thank you
too,
all.
Kristen. Thank you very much. Take care.
Yep.
Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.